There's a specific kind of quiet you only find in the deep, untamed stretches of the Ozarks. It's not the empty, sterile silence of a vacant room, but a heavy, living stillness. It's the kind of quiet that presses against your eardrums, built from the collective breath of a million unseen things. For a long time, that silence was the only thing that could keep the ghosts at bay. When I was discharged from the United States Marine Corps, I brought a lot of things back home with me. A duffel bag full of worn-out camis, a DD-214, a blown-out knee from a bad drop, and a mind that couldn't seem to figure out how to turn off. Civilian life didn't make sense anymore. The fluorescent lights of the local Walmart felt like an interrogation room, and the sudden backfire of a Ford pickup on Main Street was enough to send my heart hammering against my ribs, my hands instinctively reaching for a rifle that was no longer slung across my chest. The VA doctors called it hypervigilance. They threw a few acronyms at me, handed me a prescription for pills that made me feel like I was walking underwater, and set me on my way. I needed an anchor. I found him at a High-Kill County rescue shelter 3 weeks later. I still don't know exactly what breed Brutus was. When the shelter volunteer walked him out, she looked terrified of the leash she was holding. He was a colossal, brindle-coated mutt, likely a mix of English Mastiff, Rottweiler, and maybe a little Great Dane just to stretch him out. Even at 8 months old, his paws were the size of dinner plates, and his head looked more like a grizzly bear's than a dog's. But the moment those amber eyes locked onto mine, the tension drained out of his massive shoulders. He leaned his heavy, blocky head against my kneecap and let out a long, shuddering sigh. I knew right then that we were the same. Two bruised, overgrown strays looking for a quiet corner to bleed out or heal up. By the time he turned 2, Brutus weighed nearly 200 pounds of solid, lean muscle. He stood almost 3 feet at the shoulder. He wasn't a pet. He was my battle buddy. He had my same warrior spirit, that ride-or-die loyalty that you usually only find in a foxhole. Where I went, Brutus went. And on that particular Sunday in late October, we were heading to the only place on earth where I truly felt at peace. The property was a heavily forested stretch of about 200 acres in the rugged foothills of the Arkansas Ozarks. I won't name the nearest town. The owner is a family friend I've known since I was in Little League, and he values his privacy just as much as I do. It was prime hunting land, mostly dense hardwood timber that eventually gave way to a massive, sprawling glade near the northern property line. White-tailed deer loved to forage there in the early mornings and late evenings of the fall season. I rolled my Chevy Silverado down the washboard gravel roads, a trail of white dust kicking up in my rearview mirror. Beside me, taking up the entire passenger seat and half the center console, Brutus was dead asleep. His massive head rested on my thigh, drool cooling slightly on my faded denim jeans. I didn't mind. I had the windows cracked, letting in that familiar, crisp autumn air. If you've spent any time outdoors in the South, you know the exact smell. It's an intoxicating, earthy mix of damp topsoil, decaying hickory leaves, and the faint, sweet scent of pine sap. I parked the truck at the pull-off closest to the northern glade. The moment I cut the engine, Brutus's ears perked up, and he let out a low, rumbling yawn that vibrated through the cab. "All right, big guy," I muttered, scratching him behind the ears. "Let's go get set up." I stepped out onto the crunching gravel and reached behind the seat for my gear. My rifle was a Sig Sauer M400, a gift from my older brother the previous Christmas. I hadn't had the chance to take a deer with it yet, but I'd spent enough weekends at the range to know it fired like a dream. It wasn't entirely different from the M27 I had carried overseas, minus the fun switch, of course. I had it rigged exactly the way I liked, a top-mounted mid-range optic for the long shots across the glade, paired with a 45-degree offset red dot for any close-quarters brushwork. I also had my sidearm, a 9mm Glock 19, holstered comfortably on my hip. In Arkansas, getting a concealed carry permit is practically a rite of passage, and I never stepped foot in the woods without it. I also threw a heavy tactical backpack over my shoulders. It held the usual gear: extra magazines, a thermos of black coffee, some jerky, a high-lumen Surefire flashlight, and a massive canister of bear mace. Most locals would laugh at a guy carrying bear mace in the Ozarks. Sure, we have black bears, but they're glorified raccoons that usually scatter at the first sight of trouble. But the Marine Corps drills a prepared-for-anything mindset into your DNA. I'd bought it on clearance at a Bass Pro Shops a year prior, figuring it couldn't hurt to have in the kit. I unhooked the trailer and backed the ATV down the ramps. Brutus didn't need an invitation. He hopped right onto the back rack, balancing his massive frame with practiced ease. We rode out into the timber, the low growl of the four-wheeler's engine temporarily shattering the peace of the woods. We arrived at my favorite spot about 90 minutes before sundown. The stand wasn't some flimsy aluminum pop-up you buy at a sporting goods store. It was a permanent, custom-built wooden platform wedged into the fork of an ancient, sprawling white oak. The tree was a monster. Its roots shot out across the forest floor like the tentacles of a giant kraken, and the trunk was so thick that 5 grown men linking arms couldn't wrap around it. The stand was 40 feet up, accessed by a heavy wooden ladder that had been permanently lag-bolted into the wood. Because we didn't want any trespassers discovering our honey hole and using it, the owner and I had installed a heavy iron ladder gate about 10 feet off the ground. You had to climb up, unlock the padlock, swing the gate up, and then close it behind you. I cut the ATV engine and hopped off, pulling my rifle sling over my shoulder. Brutus jumped down, immediately putting his nose to the dirt, taking inventory of every raccoon, squirrel, and possum that had passed through in the last 24 hours. "Brutus, here," I commanded softly. He trotted over immediately, sitting at my feet. I pointed to the thick, mossy earth at the base of the giant oak. "Stay." He huffed, turned in a tight circle, and flopped down against the roots, resting his massive chin on his front paws. He blended in perfectly with the shadows and the autumn leaves. He was a good boy. He knew the drill. He would stay there, silent and still, until I came back down, content just to be near me. I climbed the ladder, unlocked the gate, and hoisted myself into the stand, securing the iron grate beneath me. I settled into the weathered swivel chair and let out a long breath. This was my church, sitting 40 feet above the ground, looking out of the sprawling, knee-high golden grass of the glade. The weight of the world simply vanished. The VA, the nightmares, the ringing in my ears, it all stayed in the truck. Up here, there was only the wind, the trees, and the hunt. For the first hour, it was perfectly idyllic. The sky above the tree line began to bruise into deep shades of purple and burnt orange as the sun dipped lower. The temperature dropped about 10 degrees, bringing a sharp, refreshing chill to the air. I kept my binoculars raised, scanning the edge of the timberline across the glade. Deer are cautious creatures. They will stand just inside the tree line for 20 minutes, practically invisible, just watching and sniffing the wind before they finally step out into the open to feed. I didn't spot any whitetail, but about 45 minutes before dark, something else caught my eye. High above the center of the glade, 2 turkey vultures were riding the thermal currents, tracing slow, lazy circles against the darkening sky. I watched them through the binos. They circled lower and lower, eventually dropping out of sight into the tall golden grass. They were feeding on a carcass. I couldn't see what it was through the vegetation, but it wasn't entirely unusual. Coyotes often took down sick fawns in this area. In fact, coyotes were considered a nuisance species in Arkansas. There was no bag limit and you could hunt them year-round. I made a mental note to keep an eye on that spot. If a coyote came back to scavenge, I'd take it out to protect the local deer population. As twilight set in, the nearly full moon began to rise, casting a pale, silver glow over the landscape. A thick, hazy fog started to roll in from the creek bed a mile away, creeping across the glade like spilled milk. The woods settled into their nocturnal rhythm. The crickets started up, and a barred owl hooted somewhere off to my right. Then, everything stopped. It was sudden. 1 second, the forest was alive with the hum of insects and the rustle of leaves. The next, it was dead silent. It was as if someone had flipped a switch. The cricket stopped. The owl went quiet. Even the wind seemed to die in the trees. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was a familiar, deeply unwanted sensation. I hadn't felt it since my second tour in Helmand Province. It was the primal, instinctual dread that washes over you right before an IED tears through the convoy, or before the first crack of an enemy sniper rifle breaks the morning calm. It was the undeniable sensation of mortal, immediate danger. A moment later, the hills surrounding the glade erupted. It started as a chorus of high-pitched yips and frantic yowls echoing through the timber. Coyotes. It sounded like a massive pack, though to the untrained ear, 3 coyotes can easily sound like 20. They were communicating, their voices frantic and overlapping. I raised my rifle, resting the handguard on the wooden rail of the stand, flipping the optic to its thermal setting. I scanned the tree line, waiting for the pack to break cover and rush the glade toward the carcass. But they didn't. Instead, the chorus of yipping abruptly ceased. The heavy, suffocating silence slammed back down over the woods. I held my breath, my eye pressed against the rubber cup of the optic, my finger resting lightly above the trigger guard. Then, a new sound tore through the stillness. It was a yelp, but not the communicative bark of a hunting dog. It was a scream. It was the desperate, agonizing sound a canine makes when it is in absolute, blinding panic. It was a plea for mercy, ringing out across the damp air with sickening clarity. And then, with a wet, heavy crunch that echoed through the trees, the scream was violently cut off. Down at the base of the tree, Brutus let out a sound I had never heard him make before. It wasn't his usual warning bark. It was a low, vibrating, demonic growl that seemed to rattle the very wood of the oak tree. I pulled my eye away from the scope and looked straight down. Brutus was no longer lying by the roots. He was standing dead square in the center of the clearing beneath the stand, facing the glade. He looked like a gargoyle carved from shadow. The thick, coarse hair along the spine and shoulders was standing straight up like a lion's mane. His lips were peeled back, exposing his massive canines, and his muscular legs were trembling, not with fear, but with raw, unbridled aggression. He was staring into the thick, creeping fog of the glade, waiting for whatever had just silenced the coyote. And deep down in my gut, as I tightened my grip on my rifle, I knew that whatever was out there was already staring back. I froze, my breath hitched in my throat, turning to a plume of silver vapor in the chilled night air. Below me, Brutus was vibrating. I could feel the low-frequency rumble of his snarl traveling up the ancient trunk of the oak, vibrating through the wooden boards of the tree stand. It was a sound of pure, calculated hatred, a warrior facing a mortal enemy. "Quiet," I whispered, the word barely ghosting past my lips. I didn't want whatever was in that fog coming here, not yet. I snapped my fingers softly. It was our code for absolute silence and immobility. Usually, Brutus would break character instantly, dropping his hocks to the dirt and going completely still. This time, he ignored me. His eyes were locked on the glade, his head lowering, jaw tensing. He was preparing to spring, oblivious to the fact that he was dwarfed by the massive roots he was standing on. "Down, damn it!" I hissed, harder this time, accompanied by a sharp click of my tongue. It was my marine voice. It broke through whatever primal spell had gripped him. He glanced up at me, amber eyes wide and strained in the moonlight, then reluctantly lowered his massive frame to the earth. He didn't relax, though. He crouched, coiled like a 200-pound spring, his muzzle resting on his paws, never breaking his stare toward the north. I turned back to the glade. The fog had grown thicker, rolling across the tall golden grass like smoke from a battlefield. Through the optical scope, it was a hazy mess. I reached up and flipped the toggle switch on my mid-range optic, engaging the thermal night vision. The world turned to an otherworldly landscape of greens and blacks. Cold ground was dark. Living things were bright, incandescent emerald. I scanned the glade, focusing on the area where the vultures had descended. Through the heat sig, I saw the cold, darkened grass parted around a small lump on the ground. A carcass, completely cold, likely a fawn killed hours ago. But a few yards beyond it, something was moving. I adjusted the focus, my heart hammering the chaotic rhythm against my ribs. In the grainy green image, I saw a large, amorphous shape push through the tall grass. My brain tried to catalog it. Too large for a coyote, wrong shape for a wolf. The shoulders were too heavy, the body too long. A bear, I thought, a surge of adrenaline flooding my system. A big black bear. Maybe it had killed the fawn and was coming back to finish it. It fits. They lumber, they shuffle. But this thing wasn't shuffling. I watched, mesmerized by the kinetic energy of its movement. It slipped through the fog with a sickening liquid grace that no bear possesses. It moved low to the ground, almost snake-like despite its mass. It was a fluid motion, totally silent, parting the tall grass without creating a ripple in the mist above it. It stopped at the carcass. I held my breath, waiting for it to tear into the cold meat. Suddenly, the green silhouette shifted. I felt a cold dread settle in my gut, a feeling colder than the Arkansas night. The shape didn't just change position, it transferred its mass. The heavy shoulders lifted, the thick spine uncoiled, snapping up with a wet, audible crackle that carried through the damp air. My finger instinctively hovered over the trigger guard. Through the thermal, I watched it rise. It kept rising. 5 feet, 6 feet. It stopped well over 7 feet tall. It was standing on 2 legs, perfectly upright, not balanced precariously like a bear trying to scent the air, but planted firmly, with a posture that was horrifyingly, undeniably hominid. It had arms, long, lanky appendages ending in massive, thick-fingered paws that looked like twisted, clawed human hands. It looked down at the carcass. In the green haze of my optic, I couldn't see the fur, but I could see the definition of dense, corded muscle rippling across its chest and shoulders. The head was long and lupine, with pointed ears swiveling in the darkness. It leaned down, not by dropping to all fours, but by bending at the waist. I watched in visceral disgust as it reached out with those human-like hands, scooped up the remaining chunk of the cold fawn carcass, and lifted it to its jaws. It ripped into the flesh with a violence that made the tree stand shake. I wasn't looking at a bear. I wasn't looking at a wolf. I was looking at something that belonged in the nightmares of early pioneers, something that the modern world had convinced itself didn't exist. I closed my eye for a second, my mind trying to rationalize the impossible image. SOP, Standard Operating Procedure, did not cover 7-foot-tall bipedal wolves eating deer with hands. I took a deep, shuddering breath, focusing on my training. Acquire the target. Analyze the threat. Act. I was 40 feet up. I had a locked iron gate. I had a tactical rifle with 30 rounds of high-velocity ammunition. I was the apex predator here. I just needed to stay calm. I opened my eye, pressed it back against the scope, and flipped the thermal setting to black hot. The image was clearer now. The creature was a dark silhouette against the paler background of the cold glade. It had finished the fawn. It stood there, surrounded by the swirling fog, moonlight catching the dampness of its coat. It was perfectly still, like a statue carved from midnight. Then, the wind betrayed me. Throughout the evening, there had been a steady breeze blowing softly from the north, carrying the smells of the glade toward me. But as the temperature dropped and the fog set in, the thermal dynamics shifted. I felt a sudden, gentle puff of air against the back of my neck. It was blowing south. directly over me, down the tree, and out across the golden grass to where the beast was standing. I stiffened. Through the scope, I saw the creature's head snap up. The long, tapered ears twisted, locking onto my position. It lifted its nose to the wind, its entire body tensing. Even through the grainy black and white optic, I could feel its gaze locked onto me with a terrifying predator intelligence. It didn't just smell a human, it smelled me. It dropped the remains of the carcass, not bothering to look down. It took a single, deliberate step toward me. Adrenaline dumped into my system, turning my vision into a tunnel. My marine training took over. There was no more analyzing, no more wondering. It was a threat. SOP activated. I acquired the dark silhouette of its chest in the center of the reticle. In the black, hot setting, I couldn't see its eyes, but I knew exactly where they were. Center mass, I muttered to myself. Standard military drill repeating in my head. Exhale, squeeze, don't pull. The Sig Sauer M400 barked into the stillness of the Ozark night. The muzzle flash was blinding, temporarily ruining my night vision through the optic. A heavy, thunderous report cracked through the hills, echoing like a thunderclap. Below me, Brutus roared, a sound of pure, deafening war. I didn't wait to check the hit. I knew it was true. You hunt as much as I have. You know what a kill shot looks like. You know the exact way an animal's body reacts to the kinetic energy of a high-powered round ripping through its vitals. I blinked, waiting for the smoke and flash to clear. I looked back through the scope, flipping it back to white-hot thermal. I exhaled. Relief washed over me, a sensation like hot water over frozen skin. The bright green silhouette of the beast was no longer standing. It was on the ground, a heap of incandescent green against the dark earth. It wasn't moving. I could see a fine, radiant plume of heat spray, blood, steaming onto the cold grass where it had been shot. I let my rifle fall on its sling, my hands shaking. I needed to breathe. I needed a second to process what had just happened. I looked down at Brutus. He had stood up, but his hackles were slightly lowered, though he was still staring at the glade with intense amber eyes. "It's okay, buddy," I called down, my voice raspy. "I got him. SOP, threat neutralized." Every hunter knows the feeling of post-shot relief. It's the moment the hunt is over, the danger is gone, and the long walk to retrieve the prize begins. But I wasn't feeling like a triumphant hunter. I felt like a survivor who had just escaped an execution. Still, curiosity won out. I had just killed something that defied science. I couldn't just leave it there. I needed to see it up close. I needed photographic proof. Otherwise, the VA doctors would just triple my meds and call me delusional. I grabbed my thermal binoculars for a wider field of view and focused on the glade. The creature's body was still lying there, green and bright against the cold. The pool of blood around it was spreading slightly. It was dead. Center mass. Kill shot. "All right, Brutus," I muttered, starting to unlock the iron ladder gate. "Let's go figure out what the hell that thing is." I stepped onto the ladder and began my 40-foot descent, unaware that in the deep Ozarks, the only certainty is that the nightmare is never truly over until the sun comes up. The descent down that 40-foot ladder felt like it took an eternity. The rusted iron rungs bit through my leather tactical gloves, cold and unforgiving. With every step, I expected the woods to erupt into that ungodly howling again, but the silence held. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet, the kind that makes the blood pound in your ears. When my boots finally hit the soft, damp earth at the base of the ancient oak, Brutus didn't greet me with his usual post-shot excitement. Normally, if I dropped a buck, he'd be vibrating, doing a tight little circle, whining to go track the blood trail. Not tonight. He stood rigid, his massive, brindle shoulders hunched, his nose lifted to the wind. The low, vibrating growl hadn't left his chest. He was a 200-pound keg of dynamite waiting for a spark. "Easy, Brutus, stand down," I whispered, though my own voice lacked conviction. I swung a leg over the seat of my Honda Rancher ATV and turned the key. The engine roared to life, shattering the nocturnal stillness. I flicked the headlights onto high beams. 2 cones of stark halogen white pierced the rolling fog, illuminating the tall golden grass of the glade like a crime scene. I patted the rear rack. Brutus didn't hesitate. He vaulted up, his claws finding purchase on the metal grating. He stood right behind me, his heavy breath hot against the back of my neck. I shifted into gear and eased the throttle open. We rolled out of the timberline and into the sea of grass. The air out here was noticeably colder, the fog clinging to my clothes like a wet sheet. As we approached the spot, the smell hit me. It wasn't just the earthy scent of the Ozarks anymore. It was an aggressive, metallic stench of hot copper and fresh blood, mixed with something distinctly foul. A rotten, musky odor like a wet dog that had been rolling and carrion. It was so potent it made my eyes water. I slowed the ATV to a crawl, the headlights cutting through the mist until they finally washed over a dark, massive mound lying in the crushed grass. I cut the engine, but left the headlights on. The sudden quiet was jarring. "Stay," I commanded Brutus, unholstering my Glock 19 with my right hand while keeping my left on the grip of my M400 rifle. I stepped off the four-wheeler, my boots crunching softly on the frost-kissed grass. The adrenaline from the shot had faded, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. Up close, the creature defied all logic. It lay on its side, its back facing me. The fur was dark, almost charcoal gray and coarse like steel wool. I could see the massive, ragged exit wound between its shoulder blades where my 5.56 round had blown through its chest cavity. The grass around it was painted in a thick, dark, steaming pool of blood. I took another step closer, my tactical flashlight sweeping over its limbs. Its legs were too long, heavily muscled and ending in digitigrade paws like a dog's, but easily 3 times the size of a timber wolf's, tipped with thick black claws that dug deep into the dirt. But it was the arms that made my stomach heave. They were terrifyingly long and gangly, heavily corded with muscle, ending in hands that were grotesque parodies of our own. It had opposable thumbs, long jointed fingers tipped with keratin claws. It was an anatomical nightmare, a freak of nature that biology shouldn't have been able to support. I let out a shaky breath. I needed a picture. I needed proof. I reached into my chest pocket with my left hand for my phone. That was when the creature moved. It started as a twitch, a sudden violent spasm in its hind leg. I froze, my thumb hovering over the screen of my phone. Hypnic jerk, my brain rationalized desperately. It's just nervous system reflex, dead nerves firing off. But then the breathing started, a wet, ragged, rattling inhale that sounded like a flooded engine trying to turn over. Behind me, Brutus erupted into a deafening, savage bark, launching himself off the ATV. Before I could even drop my phone and bring my rifle to bear, the creature rolled over. It didn't struggle to its feet. It moved with a terrifying, explosive agility. It pushed off the ground with those human-like hands, rolling back onto all fours, its spine arching as it spun to face me. My heart stopped. Illuminated by the stark glare of the ATV headlights, the monster's face was a vision of pure, unadulterated hell. The snout was elongated, the lips peeled back to reveal rows of serrated, yellow teeth dripping with viscous saliva and blood. But it was the eyes that broke me. They weren't the glassy, unthinking eyes of a wild animal. They were a brilliant, luminescent green, burning with a malicious, calculating intelligence. It looked at me, looked at the rifle slung across my chest, and it understood. There was an awareness there that I had only ever seen in the eyes of enemy combatants right before a firefight. It let out a roar, a sound so deep, so incredibly loud, that I physically felt the concussive wave hit my chest. Everything shifted into the agonizing slow motion of combat perception. The beast's muscles coiled under its dark fur. It was going to lunge. I let my M400 drop entirely onto its sling, realizing it was too long and clumsy for point-blank range. I thrust my left arm out instinctively, bracing for the impact, while my right hand snapped the Glock 19 up, my thumb sweeping the safety. But I was too slow. The creature exploded off the ground. It didn't just jump, it launched itself through the air with the kinetic force of a mortar shell. Its jaws were open, aiming directly for my throat. I saw the individual droplets of saliva flying from its teeth. I knew with absolute certainty that it was going to tear my head from my shoulders before I could even pull the trigger. Then, a blur of brindle fur and rippling muscle intercepted the nightmare. Brutus hit the creature mid-air. 200 pounds of fiercely loyal mastiff slammed into the side of the beast like a runaway freight train. The impact sounded like two cars colliding. The creature's trajectory was thrown off, and the two massive animals crashed into the dirt just 5 feet to my left, a violently thrashing ball of claws, teeth, and fur. "Brutus!" I screamed, my voice cracking. The monster was back on its feet in a microsecond, shaking off the impact, but Brutus was already there, placing his massive body squarely between me and the beast. My dog, my best friend, stood his ground, snarling with a ferocity I didn't know he possessed. Yet, despite Brutus's immense size, the creature absolutely dwarfed him. The monster lunged again. I leveled the tritium sights of my Glock over the creature's broad chest and squeezed the trigger as fast as my finger could reset. Crack, 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 crack. The muzzle flashes lit up the fog. I dumped 9mm hollow points directly into the beast's center mass. I saw the impacts, the fur parting, the flesh rippling as the bullets struck home. But it didn't even flinch. It was like I was shooting a ballistic dummy with a pellet gun. The creature ignored me entirely, its focus solely on the dog that had dared to challenge it. It swung one of its massive, human-like hands down, catching Brutus by the side of the head. The blow was sickeningly heavy. It knocked Brutus sideways, but before he could recover, the monster lunged forward and clamped its massive jaws down hard on the back of Brutus's neck. A horrific, wet crunch echoed over the gunfire, followed by a high-pitched, agonizing yelp that will haunt my nightmares until the day I die. The beast shook its head violently, whipping Brutus through the air like a rag doll. It released its grip, sending my 200-pound dog rolling 10 yards away into the tall grass, whimpering and thrashing in a pool of his own blood. "No!" I roared. I didn't stop firing. The slide of my Glock locked back on an empty chamber. 15 rounds. I had dumped 15 rounds of defense ammunition into this thing's chest at point-blank range, and it was still standing. I've been in combat. I've seen a Humvee blown apart by an IED right in front of my eyes. I've had RPGs explode against the walls of the compound I was defending. I know what terror is. But in that moment, staring at a blood-soaked, invincible monster bathed in the headlights of my ATV, I experienced a level of pure, primal horror that made my military deployments look like a walk in the park. The creature slowly turned its massive, lupine head back to me. Blood, Brutus's blood, dripped heavily from its jaws. Its green eyes narrowed, the muscles in its thighs bunched together. It was my turn. I dropped the empty Glock into the grass and grabbed the handguard of my slung M400, ripping it up to my shoulder. But my magazine was empty from the initial shot, and in my panic, I had forgotten to reload. Click. Dead man's click. The beast pushed off the ground, launching itself at me. But out of the corner of my eye, a bloody, broken shape launched itself forward. Brutus. God, my brave, beautiful boy. Despite a shattered mech and massive blood loss, he threw himself at the monster's hind legs, sinking his teeth into the creature's hamstring with every ounce of strength he had left. The sudden drag pulled the creature off balance. It crashed to the dirt just 3 feet from me, roaring in furious surprise. It twisted around, tearing at the dog attached to its leg. It bought me 3 seconds. I ripped my backpack off, my hands moving with frantic, practiced efficiency. I grabbed a spare 30-round magazine of 5.56, slammed it into the magwell of the SIG, and racked the charging handle. I brought the optic to my eye just in time to witness the end. The creature didn't bite Brutus this time. It simply raised one of its massive clawed hands and brought it down across my dog's back with the force of a sledgehammer. The sound of breaking bone was absolute. Brutus went limp, his jaws releasing the monster's leg. He hit the ground and didn't move again. There was a split second of absolute clarity, a brutal, agonizing calculus that every soldier eventually has to face when things go completely to hell. My dog was dead. The creature was practically bulletproof. If I stayed, I was going to be ripped to shreds. I had to run. I didn't even aim. I just held the trigger down, sweeping the barrel across the creature, dumping half the magazine into its body to suppress it. The beast flinched, raising a thick arm to shield its face from the high-velocity rounds, stepping backward into the shadows of the tall grass. I spun around, vaulted onto the seat of the idling ATV, and slammed the gear shifter up. I grabbed a handful of throttle and dumped the clutch. The rear tires spun wildly, throwing roosters of mud and grass into the air before finding traction. The four-wheeler leaped forward, tearing through the glade back toward the safety of the ancient oak tree. Tears were streaming down my face, blurring my vision. The wind roared in my ears, but it wasn't loud enough to drown out the sickening, wet sounds of tearing flesh that began echoing from the spot I had just left. The monster wasn't chasing me. It was eating my best friend. I hit the base of the oak tree so hard the ATV bounced off the massive roots. I didn't bother turning it off. I abandoned the machine, leapt onto the iron ladder, and climbed. I climbed with a frantic, animalistic desperation, my boots slipping on the rungs, my breath tearing through my lungs like glass. I reached the platform, hauled myself over the edge, and slammed the heavy iron gate down behind me, securing the thick metal latch. I scrambled to the back of the wooden stand, pressing my spine against the rough bark of the massive trunk, pulling my knees to my chest. I sat there in the dark, 40 feet in the air, trembling violently. I checked my rifle, 15 rounds left. I drew my knees tighter, fighting the urge to vomit, as the wet, tearing sounds from the glade drifted up through the cold Ozark fog. I was trapped, and I knew, with sickening certainty, that once it was finished with Brutus, it would come looking for me. Up in the suffocating darkness of the deer stand, time lost all meaning. It could have been 10 minutes. It could have been an hour. I sat with my spine pressed so hard against the rough, freezing bark of the ancient white oak that I could feel the deep grooves digging through my jacket and into my skin. I pulled my knees tight to my chest, making myself as small a target as humanly possible, my hands wrapped around the pistol grip and handguard of my Sig Sauer M400 with a white-knuckled, deathly grip. Below me, drifting through the dense, swirling Ozark fog, came the sounds. They were the kind of sounds that break a man's mind. Wet, heavy tearing, the sickening, rhythmic crunch of thick bones being splintered like dry kindling, the sloppy, guttural grunts of a massive predator gorging itself on fresh meat. Every snap, every tear echoed off the surrounding timber, magnified by the cold night air until it felt like the monster was sitting right next to me in the dark. I clamped my jaw shut, biting down on the inside of my cheek until I tasted hot copper, trying desperately to keep my breathing shallow and silent. The tears had frozen on my face, leaving my skin tight and stinging. I had survived mortar fire in Sanguin. I had pulled friends out of burning Humvees, but I had never felt a failure as profound and absolute as what I was feeling right now. Brutus, my 200-pound shadow, the only living thing that had been able to drag me out of my post-deployment darkness, was being consumed down in that glade. He had thrown himself into the jaws of a nightmare to buy me 3 seconds to run, and I had taken them. I had run. "Stay frosty," a ghost of my old drill instructor whispered in the back of my mind. "Panic kills. Assess your gear. Assess your environment." I forced my eyes open, blinking away the stinging moisture. I needed to take inventory. I slowly, agonizingly moved my left hand down to my tactical chest rig. My Glock 19 was gone, dropped in the tall grass during the frantic retreat. I had the M400. I ran my thumb over the magazine release, carefully pulling the mag out just enough to feel the weight and visually check the brass in the dim moonlight. I had fired heavily in my panic. I had exactly 11 rounds of 5.56 green tip ammunition left. 11 rounds to stop a creature that had already absorbed 15 9mm hollow points and half a rifle magazine without so much as a limp. I slid the magazine back into the mag well with a soft click and rested the rifle across my knees. I had my combat knife sheathed on my belt, a 6-inch K-bar that felt entirely useless against a beast that could snap a mastiff's neck with one hand. And I had my tactical backpack, which I had managed to drag up the ladder with me. Suddenly, the sounds from the glade stopped. The silence that followed was infinitely worse than the horrific noises of the feast. It was a heavy, pregnant stillness, thick with impending violence. The crickets were dead quiet. The wind had died completely. The only sound was the frantic, erratic thudding of my own heart against my ribs. It was finished, and now it was going to look for the one that got away. I slowly raised the rifle, resting the handguard on the wooden railing of the stand, and flipped the optic back to the thermal setting. My hands were shaking so badly that the green screen jittered violently. I took a deep, shuddering breath, holding it in my lungs to steady my core, and pressed my eye to the rubber cup. I scanned the glade where I had left the ATV. The Honda Rancher was still there, a massive block of fading heat. Just beyond it, glowing with a sickeningly bright, incandescent green, was a scattered, horrific mess, the thermal signature of what was left of Brutus. But the massive, towering heat signature of the creature was gone. I swept the optic left, tracing the edge of the tree line. Nothing. I swept it right, scanning the tall golden grass. Nothing. The fog was acting as an insulator, masking the finer details, but a creature of that immense size should have been glowing like a beacon. "Where are you?" I thought, my finger resting lightly against the trigger guard. "Where did you go?" Then the smell arrived. It drifted straight up from the base of the oak tree. It was an overwhelming, gag-inducing wave of slaughterhouse stench, hot, coppery blood mixed with the foul, musky odor of damp, decaying fur and ozone. It was so potent it physically stung the inside of my nostrils. It wasn't out in the glade. It was directly beneath me. I slowly pulled the rifle back, leaning over the edge of the wooden platform, and looked down through the iron grate of the trapdoor. The moonlight was filtering through the skeletal, leafless canopy of the autumn trees, casting long, twisting shadows across the forest floor. There, circling the massive, gnarled roots of the ancient oak, was the monster. It was walking on 2 legs now, pacing with a fluid, terrifying grace. It didn't move like an animal acting on instinct. It moved like a tactical operator assessing a fortified compound. It tilted its massive lupine head upward, its elongated snout testing the air. Blood, thick, dark, and viscous, was smeared across its muzzle and matted into the coarse gray fur of its chest. It stopped pacing. It looked straight up. Even from 40 feet away, in the dim, silvery light of the moon, I could see those eyes. They were glowing with a sickly, luminescent green light, entirely independent of the ambient reflection. They locked onto mine through the grate. There was no mistaking the intelligence burning behind those pupils. It wasn't just hungry, it was furious. It knew exactly what I was, exactly what I had done to it, and exactly where I was hiding. It stepped closer to the trunk, placing one of its massive human-like hands against the rough bark. The claws, easily 4 inches long and thick as steel spikes, dug effortlessly into the hard wood. It looked up at the lowest branches of the oak. Because the tree was so ancient, the first viable branch, one thick enough to support the weight of a 200-pound man, let alone a creature that likely weighed twice that, was a solid 15 feet off the ground. No natural predator in North America, not a mountain lion, not a black bear, could jump that high from a standing position. But I had already learned that this thing was not bound by the laws of nature. The creature sank into a deep, muscular squat, its digitigrade legs coiling like massive hydraulic springs. The muscles in its thighs and calves bulged grotesquely beneath the fur. No, I thought, bringing the M400 up and aiming down through the grate, there's no way. With a sound like a cracking whip, the beast exploded upward. It didn't just jump, it launched itself vertically with terrifying ballistic force. It sailed through the air, completely clearing the 10-foot mark, its long arms reaching out. It hit the massive trunk just below the target branch, its hind claws slamming into the bark for a microsecond of leverage, propelling it the rest of the way. Its massive, grotesque hands slammed over the top of the thick branch. The wood groaned loudly under the sudden, immense weight. It was 15 feet closer to me in the blink of an eye. It began to pull itself up, muscles rippling. "Get back down!" I screamed, the raw panic tearing my throat. I aimed the red dot sight directly at its center mass and squeezed the trigger. Crack, crack, crack! The muzzle flashes illuminated the canopy in strobes of violet white light. The 5.56 green-tip penetrator rounds slammed into the creature's back and shoulders. I saw the impacts, little puffs of dark fur and blood erupting in the strobe light. The kinetic shock of the heavy rifle rounds was finally enough to disrupt its momentum. The creature let out a high-pitched, agonizing yelp, a sound so purely canine it was jarring. Its grip slipped. The massive claws tore through the thick oak bark, sending a shower of splinters raining down to the forest floor. It plummeted backward, falling 15 feet and crashing onto the massive roots below with a bone-shaking thud that vibrated all the way up the trunk. I stopped firing, gasping for air, the rifle smoking in the cold night. 8 rounds left. Down below, the creature lay motionless for a few seconds. I prayed that the fall had broken its neck or that one of the rounds had finally found its spine. But my hope was short-lived. With a horrifyingly fluid motion, it rolled over and pushed itself back up to its feet. It shook its head violently, spraying dark blood across the roots, and looked back up at me. They say the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. This creature was decidedly not insane. It possessed a terrifying capacity to learn. It didn't try to jump again. Instead, it began to circle the massive trunk, its glowing green eyes scanning the structure of the tree and the stand. It disappeared from my line of sight for a moment as it moved around to the backside of the oak. I shuffled frantically on my knees, turning in the confined space of the stand, trying to track it. Then I heard a sound that made my blood run absolute ice. Clang! It was the heavy, metallic sound of a massive claw striking hollow iron. Clang! It had found the ladder. I scrambled to the edge and looked down. The creature was standing at the base of the iron ladder that was lag-bolted into the tree. It reached up, testing the metal rungs with its hands. It understood the mechanism. It didn't try to rip the ladder down. It began to climb. Clang, clang. It moved with surprising, terrifying efficiency, hand over hand, foot over foot, its massive frame ascending the iron rungs with the speed of an ape. It was clearing 5 feet every few seconds. I swung the rifle down, aiming through the rungs, but the angle was terrible. The iron steps and the thick wooden support beams of the stand were blocking a clear shot. If I fired now, I'd likely just ricochet a round off the metal, or worse, miss entirely and waste my precious remaining ammunition. Clang, clang. It was 20 feet up, halfway to me. I could hear its ragged, wet breathing over the sound of the metal groaning under its weight. Bullets weren't going to stop it. Not before it reached the gate. Even if I dumped the rest of the magazine into its skull as it crested the platform, its sheer momentum and size would carry it through the trapdoor and into the stand with me. In close quarters, with a beast that size, I wouldn't last 5 seconds. I dropped the rifle onto its sling and spun around, my hands tearing frantically at the zippers of my tactical backpack. My fingers were clumsy, numb from the cold and the adrenaline. I ripped the main compartment open, throwing aside spare socks, a flashlight, and a thermos until my hand closed around a large, cold aluminum cylinder. The bear spray. It was a heavy-duty, maximum-strength canister of capsaicin deterrent designed to create a massive 30-foot cloud of chemical fire capable of stopping a charging grizzly in its tracks. It was the only weapon I had left that didn't rely on kinetic trauma. I ripped the canister out of the bag and scrambled back to the trapdoor grate. Clang, clang. It was right beneath me, 35 feet up. I could smell its foul, bloody breath wafting up through the iron bars. I heard the lock rattle as the creature reached up and shoved its massive hand against the iron gate. The metal hinges screamed in protest, bowing slightly under the immense pressure. I shoved my thumb under the orange safety wedge on the top of the canister and snapped it off. The heavy iron grate began to lift. The creature was forcing it open, brute-forcing the heavy latch I had secured. A massive, fur-covered shoulder pushed through the gap, followed by the terrifying, elongated snout. The green eyes snapped onto me, burning with a violent, victorious hatred. It opened its jaws, preparing to let out a deafening roar as it breached my sanctuary. I didn't hesitate. I shoved the nozzle of the canister directly downward, barely 3 feet from its face, and depressed the trigger with both thumbs. A high-pressure hiss erupted from the can, accompanied by a violent, expanding cloud of dense, yellowish-orange chemical vapor. I emptied the entire canister in one long, continuous burst, spraying a solid wall of pure, concentrated capsaicin directly into the monster's open mouth, its nose, and its glowing green eyes. The reaction was instantaneous and apocalyptic. The creature didn't roar, it shrieked. It was a high-pitched, gargling scream of absolute blinding agony that tore through the Ozark night. The chemical fire stripped away its predator instincts in a fraction of a second. It threw both of its human-like hands up to its face, clawing frantically at its own eyes, completely forgetting where it was. It let go of the latter. I watched, coughing violently as the edges of the pepper cloud drifted back up into my own face, as the massive 200-plus-pound monster fell backward into the abyss. It plummeted the full 40 feet, thrashing and shrieking in the empty air. It hit the ground with an earth-shattering thud that sounded like a dropped piano. Down below, the creature rolled frantically in the dirt and dead leaves, unleashing a chorus of pathetic, agonizing yelps and sneezes, a sound exactly like a domestic dog that had shoved its nose into a hornet's nest. The pure, undiluted pepper spray had overwhelmed its hypersensitive canine olfactory system and blinded its eyes. I slammed the iron grate shut, threw my body weight onto it to secure the latch, and backed away, gasping for untainted care, my eyes streaming with tears from both the chemicals and the adrenaline. Below me, the thrashing eventually stopped. I heard the heavy, panicked thud of massive paws tearing through the underbrush, growing fainter and fainter as the blinded, agonizing creature fled wildly into the deep timber, leaving nothing but the suffocating fog and the cold, terrifying silence behind. The yellow-orange cloud of capsaicin slowly dissipated into the thick Ozark fog, but its phantom burn lingered in the air, stinging the back of my throat and forcing tears from my already raw eyes. I slumped back against the unforgiving, deeply grooved bark of the ancient white oak, my chest heaving in ragged, painful gasps. The metallic clanging of the ladder and the ungodly, gargling shrieks of the monster had faded into the deep timber, replaced once again by that suffocating, heavy silence. I didn't move for what must have been hours. My body was locked in a state of sheer, paralyzing shock, my nervous system utterly fried by the massive, sustained dump of adrenaline. My fingers, clad in tactical leather gloves, were clamped so tightly around the grip and handguard of my Sig Sauer M400 that they had gone entirely numb. I couldn't feel the cold metal anymore. I couldn't feel much of anything except the violent, erratic hammering of my own heart against my ribcage and the freezing October air biting through my jacket. I forced my violently shaking hands to move. With slow, agonizing precision, I dropped the magazine from the rifle. I reached into my tactical rig, pulling out the few loose 5.56 rounds I had stuffed into a pouch, and pressed them into the metal feed lips of the magazine. Click, click, click. The sound of brass sliding into place was the only thing anchoring me to reality. I slammed the magazine back home and racked the charging handle, chambering around. I had exactly 14 shots left. If that thing came back, 14 rounds of green-tip penetrator wouldn't be enough to kill it, but it might be enough to buy me a quick death. The night stretched on into an agonizing eternity. The temperature plummeted, as it often does in the Arkansas foothills, dropping well below freezing. Frost began to form on the iron grate of the trapdoor and the wooden railings of the deer stand, sparkling like crushed glass in the pale moonlight. I pulled my knees tighter to my chest, burying my face in the collar of my jacket, violently shivering. Every snapping twig in the forest below, every rustle of dry leaves caught in a sudden updraft sent a fresh spike of terror straight through my veins. I spent the dark hours staring through the thermal optic, sweeping the ghostly green landscape for any massive bipedal heat signature. My mind played cruel, torturous tricks on me. Shadows twisted into hulking, wolf-like shapes. The distant hoot of a barred owl sounded like a nascent, bubbling growl. But the worst part wasn't the fear of the monster returning. The worst part was the memory playing on an endless, inescapable loop behind my eyelids. Every time I blinked, I saw Brutus. I saw his massive, brindle body launching through the air, throwing himself into the jaws of a nightmare that he had to know he couldn't beat. I heard the sickening crunch of his spine. I heard his final, agonizing yelp. The guilt was a physical weight, heavier than my body armor had ever been. I had brought him out here. I had told him to stay. I was a Marine, trained to protect, trained to engage the enemy, and I had frozen. I had let my best friend die to save my own skin. The VA doctors always talked about survivor's guilt as a theoretical concept, a hurdle to work through in group therapy. Sitting 40 feet up in that freezing oak tree, it wasn't a theory. It was a cancer eating me alive from the inside out. The transition from night to morning was painfully slow. It didn't arrive with a burst of golden sunlight, but rather a slow, bruised graying of the eastern horizon. The inky blackness of the sky faded into a dull slate purple, and the stars blinked out one by one. The fog that had blanketed the glade began to lift slightly, retreating into the creek beds and hollows, leaving the golden grass frosted and stiff. The Ozarks began to wake up, blissfully ignorant of the slaughter that had occurred in the dark. A flock of crows flew overhead, their harsh caws breaking the silence. A squirrel chattered from a nearby hickory tree. It was a beautiful, crisp autumn morning, the kind of morning I usually lived for. But today, the beauty felt like a sick, twisted joke. I waited until the sun had fully crested the tree line, casting long, sharp shadows across the glade. I needed full visibility. I couldn't risk climbing down into the brush if there was even a shadow of a doubt that the creature was waiting in ambush. I stood up slowly, My joints popped and groaned in protest. My muscles locked tight from the freezing temperatures and hours of absolute immobility. I slung the M400 across my chest, keeping it at the low ready, and unlatched the heavy iron gate. The descent was terrifying. Every time my boot hit an iron rung, the metallic clang felt loud enough to wake the dead. I kept my head on a swivel, scanning the perimeter, my finger resting just above the trigger guard. As I climbed down, I saw the physical evidence of the nightmare. About 15 feet up the trunk, the thick, ancient bark of the white oak had been shredded. Massive, deep gouges, claw marks easily an inch deep and spaced like human fingers, were ripped through the wood where the beast had tried to pull itself up. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't a PTSD flashback. The monster was terrifyingly real. When my boots finally touched the frosty earth, I drew my K-bar combat knife with my left hand, holding the rifle with my right. I moved with slow, deliberate tactical steps, sweeping my sectors just like I had on patrol in Helmand Province. The base of the tree reeked of capsaicin and dried blood. I stepped out from beneath the canopy of the oak and into the tall grass of the glade, making a beeline for the Honda ATV. It sat exactly where I had abandoned it, covered in a thin layer of morning frost. Then my eyes fell on the spot a few yards to the left. I dropped the K-bar. It landed in the dirt with a soft thud. The combat conditioning, the tactical awareness, the survival instincts, they all evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a broken man. I won't describe the gruesome details of what remained of Brutus. It's too painful to commit to paper, and it strips away the dignity of the bravest soul I've ever known. Suffice it to say that the creature had not killed for sport, it had killed for sustenance, and it had done so with a savage, unholy brutality. The brindle coat that I had brushed just yesterday was matted with dark, frozen blood. I fell to my knees in the frost-covered grass. The tears that the cold and the fear had held back finally broke loose. I wept. I sobbed until my lungs burned and my vision blurred, burying my face in my gloved hands. I apologized to him over and over again, my voice a ragged, pathetic croak in the empty woods. I begged his forgiveness for bringing him here, for not shooting faster, for running away. I sat there in the dirt for a long time, mourning the only friend who had ever truly understood the quiet, broken parts of my soul. Eventually, the survival instinct kicked back in. I couldn't leave him here. I couldn't let the turkey vultures or the coyotes pick at what was left of him. I forced myself to stand up. I walked over to the ATV and unstrapped the heavy olive-drab canvas tarp I kept bundled on the front rack for rain emergencies. I carried the canvas over to Brutus. With hands that shook uncontrollably, I gently wrapped the tarp around him, bundling his massive frame as carefully and respectfully as I could. I thought about the flag-draped transfer cases at Dover Air Force Base. He deserved a hero's return, and this crude canvas shroud was the best I could do. He was incredibly heavy, practically dead weight, but adrenaline and grief fueled my muscles. I managed to hoist the canvas-wrapped bundle onto the rear rack of the Honda, securing it tightly with bungee cords and ratchet straps. I didn't care about the blood getting on the machine. I retrieved my dropped Glock 19 from the grass, wiping the dirt from the slide, and holstered it. I picked up my knife. I mounted the ATV, started the engine, and drove out of the glade without ever looking back. The ride back to my Chevy Silverado was a blur of hypervigilance. I drove with my M400 resting across my lap, my eyes darting frantically to every shadow, every thick patch of underbrush, fully expecting a towering wolf-like monstrosity to burst from the timber and finish what it started. But nothing came. The woods remained quiet, entirely indifferent to my shattered world. I loaded the ATV and my dog's remains onto the trailer, locked everything down, and climbed into the cab of the truck. The drive back to civilization was the loneliest journey of my life. The passenger seat, usually occupied by a massive, drooling, snoring blockhead, was agonizingly empty. When I finally reached my small property on the outskirts of town, I didn't go inside. I went straight to the detached garage, grabbed a heavy steel spade, and walked out to the back corner of my yard, beneath the shade of a massive weeping willow. I dug for 3 hours. I dug until the blisters on my hands popped and bled, until my shoulders screamed in agony, using the physical exhaustion to numb the emotional hollow in my chest. When the grave was deep enough, I gently lowered the canvas bundle into the Arkansas soil. I didn't have a flag to drape over him, and I didn't know any prayers that seemed fitting for a dog who fought a demon. So I just stood at attention, gave him a crisp, slow salute, and filled in the dirt. It has been nearly a year since that night in the Ozarks. I never went back to that property. I called my friend, the landowner, and told him a vague story about a massive pack of feral hogs making the area too dangerous to hunt. I couldn't bring myself to tell him the truth. Nobody would believe it. They'd assumed the PTSD had finally cracked my reality, that I'd shot my own dog in a paranoid delusion. Only I know the truth. Only I know what those glowing green eyes looked like. I still have his heavy, studded leather collar. It hangs from the rearview mirror of my Silverado, swaying gently with every turn I make. His heavy-duty leash is still hanging on the brass hook right next to my front door. I can't bring myself to put them in a box. I can't bring myself to erase the footprint he left on my life. Every time I get in the truck, I touch the worn leather of his collar, and I am instantly transported back to the cold, the fog, and the blood. I don't sleep well anymore. The hypervigilance is back, worse than when I first returned from overseas. I keep the Glock 19 on my nightstand, a loaded AR-15 under the bed, and the security lights blazing outside my house all night long. Because I know that things exist out there in the dark, things that defy biology, things that walk like men but slaughter like beasts. I didn't share this story to get sympathy. I'm sharing it as a warning to anyone who thinks they are at the top of the food chain just because they carry a gun. The wilderness of the American continent is vast, ancient, and deeply unforgiving. The Ozarks, the Appalachians, the deep hollows, they hide secrets that were old before the first settlers ever built a fire. If you are going out into the deep woods at night, do not underestimate the dark. Bring a heavy caliber sidearm. Bring a rifle. If you don't have bear spray, buy the largest canister you can find and keep it on your chest. But most importantly, if the woods suddenly go dead silent and you feel the hair on the back of your neck stand up, don't wait to see what's making the shadows move. Just run, because I promise you, there are monsters out there in the dark, and if you aren't careful, if you hesitate for even a second, you might just end up on the menu.